who is very vulnerable because of his pride. And they establish a law that says that nobody should pray to anyone other than the king. Isn't it interesting that the king is quite happy to have someone make a law like that? Everybody's going to pay attention to me, treat me like I'm divine. That would be okay. Sure, let's make that law. Well, they trick him into doing that, and God's servant Daniel continues in his singular devotion to serve the living and true God. And because of that, he faces consequences. He's thrown into a pit of devouring hungry lions. But, just as he did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, the Lord is with Daniel. God delivers him, and the enemies of Daniel receive instead the punishment that was intended for Daniel. Though they rage, Psalm 2, though they rage against the cause of Yahweh and His anointed one, they do so in vain. Now, doubtless you have a pretty good idea, again, of what the main lesson is here. The lesson seems to be a call to faithfulness under pressure. Faithfulness under pressure. And like so many other Bible stories, we're called to walk blamelessly as citizens of heaven, even though we're living on a hostile earth. That's a very common sermon theme, isn't it? Go out there, be faithful. You've probably heard that sermon before. So I'm guessing what's going to motivate you to be thinking about this particular passage today is in such that you think, I expect to go away from here today changed. Well, I can only imagine that'll happen if we realize something that's very key here, and that is that the dilemma that Daniel faces here is so similar to our dilemma today. We seek to change and become more like Daniel only when we're going to develop a belief of the truth that is revealed in Daniel's story regarding how God deals with those who trust Him. Those who are faithful, those are looking to Him in faith, and the impact that they have on their society around them, the community of those who are living around that person. So that's what we're looking for as we read this text today, is to say, how can I capture how real the situation was for Daniel and how real it is in parallel to us as well. So let's read the 28 verses here of chapter 6. And you'll notice immediately that we're under a new king. Daniel is outliving all these other kings. It seems like they don't last. God rises up one and puts another one in his place. This is what we read. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Now then, this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful. And no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." And then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever." All high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction, that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. Now, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. And then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. And then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which can't be revoked. And they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you've signed. But he makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. And then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it's a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. And the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. And the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at daybreak, break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I've done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Once again, I kind of feel like that would be enough. That's such an excellent writing of what has taken place. Now, let me just simply state the main point of, I think, what we're looking at in the passage again, and that is that the calling of us as believers is to be above reproach in this hostile world that we live in. But of course, that doesn't always guarantee an avoidance of opposition. In fact, sometimes it welcomes or invites that opposition. And that being said, God's honored and his kingdom is advanced when believers are faithful. They may live in peace because God is their protector. You remember that Daniel is one we're looking to as someone to model after, much like Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. Daniel had resolved in chapter 1 as a young man, very young man, to not defile himself, even though he was going to be taken into a cult context of paganism. That was a resolve to live out his faith in that context of the pagan land with integrity, without compromise. Now, I'm pretty sure Daniel had no idea what the impact of that was going to be. What impact his faithfulness would have on the years of captivity for the nation of Israel. But he was resolved, nevertheless, to do it, even if he was the only one who ever noticed it, or if God was the only one who ever noticed it. And I think you and I are called to this same resolve. Is it your life goal this evening. Think about this. Is it your life goal to be above reproach in the eyes of an unbelieving world? To walk before your God in a confident resolve to glorify Him in everything you do and to enjoy Him as you do it. We talk often about our chief end, to glorify God and enjoy Him. Is that your goal in your life, as it was here in Daniel's life? Well, I'm always fascinated by what people put on their cars, what stickers they stick on there to make some statement about themselves or something that they hold as a point that they want to believe in and trust in. There's a sticker out there right now that's very common. It's called, "It's okay not to be okay." Have you seen that one? Now, the point of that mental health awareness sticker, that's what it's about, is mental health. That's a good one, right? That admits that we mustn't pretend to be okay when we're not okay. Acting as if things are fine in our lives and we go through life with this big mask in front of our faces, acting like everything's great when it's not. We should not do that. And we should acknowledge that things are not okay at times, that sometimes life is a mess. It's very hard to cope in life. And as we admit that, then we're open to have help. We can find the help that we need in society. So in that sense, it's a really good sticker. But what it's done to me as I see that sticker, and I see it so often, is it's made me wonder, what would it be like to put a sticker on your car that said, "It's okay to be okay"? It's okay to be okay. And my reason for thinking that way is that perhaps it should be good to live in a society where our goal is that we would be able to live lives that are okay. Where the norm is not discouragement and depression and dysfunction. Where people aren't in traumatic circumstances all the time. Where marriages can actually be happy marriages. Where families can be secure and they can experience real joy in things. Isn't that really a hope that Christians hold on to? We admit that we can get to be a mess sometimes, that we can deal with very hard things, and that we can fall apart. So it's okay not to be okay under those circumstances, but our goal is not to say, it's okay not to be okay, and I'm fine with that. I'm going to be that way the rest of my life. It doesn't mean that there aren't times like that in our lives where things can seem to be falling apart, but generally, life can be lived, even in a fallen world, with joy. You can be okay. The norm ought to be not the mental distress, but a peace that passes all understanding as our hearts are guarded by the Spirit of God. Well, the pressures in this world under the influence of our enemy, Satan, are great to rob us of joy and peace and those kinds of things. To suggest that faithfulness to God is actually pointless, that you're just going to be not okay. And I suggest what Daniel does in a context like that is say, no, I trust my God that He will help me be okay in all circumstances, even under hard circumstances. If you want to look at his life, you could say, well, things aren't going to be okay when the king and all his officials are really plotting against him. But you'll notice that Daniel's more concerned with simply walking before God in faithfulness. He wants to please his heavenly Father. He's not so concerned with all those peers that might be looking at his life. He knew God was observing his life, and that was enough for him. And he resolved to be faithful. And so I think it's good for us to ask, what does faithfulness look like? That's our first point. What's faithfulness look like? And the first thing it looks like is different. It's different. It's different from those around you in the world, and people notice the difference. Now, I think what happens to us sometimes as Christians is that we're afraid we're standing out too much, and we don't want to be seen to be that different from our society. We don't want to be obnoxious in the sense that these Christians, look at them, they're so holier than thou or something like that. But I want to suggest to you that when we desire, in a sense, not to be noticed by our neighbors, that's in fact counterproductive to what God calls Christians to be about. We are actually called to stand out from the world. We're called out, ecclesia, we are called out of the world to be different from the world, but we are also called to show that difference because God has made a difference in our lives. And you'll notice that all three kings that we've studied so far who have worked with Daniel have noticed that about Daniel. They've noticed about his exceptional character. Chapter 1 spoke of Daniel and his companions as standing out, as in better condition than the rest of the young men in the society around him. Chapter 2 speaks of him as unique among all the wise men in his wisdom and his abilities that God had given him. Chapter 3 tells that among the entire population of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, which was pretty big, out of all of those people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego literally stood out. Everybody else bowed down, but they stood out. They were noticed. When everyone else was conforming to an evil practice, they would not do so. Again, in chapter 4, Daniel alone is the only one the king can find who will help him out of all of his choices. And when the king needs wisdom and a solution to his dilemma, in chapter 5, the queen thinks of one man. Who is it? It's Daniel. He stands out as different among his peers. One thing that we should know, and we should be very honest about this, is that faithfulness, when you stand out because of faithfulness, it will attract trouble in a fallen world. I said that being above reproach doesn't guarantee avoidance of opposition. In fact, sometimes it actually invites it. And certainly that's the case here for Daniel. Standing out in excellence. Standing out in a discipline that was a godly discipline in his life, and in faithfulness. Those who looked at him were jealous. For those who are less than excellent, those who are less than disciplined, those who are less than faithful, will not like the contrast you're showing. If you're recognized in your workplace, for example, and you're promoted because you're being the one who's faithful, you have a good work ethic, or whatever it may be, you're performing faithfully, you're going to be resented by those who want to maintain their positions, make the same amount of money, and not have to do the hard work. So the wise men, the satraps, the prefects, the high officials, the governors resented this foreigner, this Jewish man, in how he had always risen to the top. And he now sat in a position as one of the three highest in the kingdom of their area. He was promoted over his peers, and his peers hated him for it. There are a lot of reasons why people resent faithfulness when they see it. I think primarily it points out their own unfaithfulness. It reminds them of a standard that they do not meet. And so these haters of Daniel sought to take him down, and it really is not remarkable that they wanted to do that. It happens all the time in our society. If somebody rises up because of faithfulness, they will be torn down. But what's amazing in the story is that when they try to do it, they can't find any grounds by which to make it happen. Nothing by which they can accuse Daniel of doing, or some complaint that they can bring up against him. Now in politics, we're pretty familiar with the strategy of mudslinging, right? We're familiar with this idea of what you do is if you want to take down your enemy, you find out all the information you can about them, where they've failed, where they've fallen short, and you bring it up and you spread it everywhere so everybody knows this about them. You undermine it that way. But in Daniel's case, his faithfulness made that very, very difficult. They couldn't think of anything. There's simply no mud to sling at Daniel, it seemed. No grounds for complaint. And in this, I want us to see that Daniel is very much a type of Christ. He's not Christ, but he's a type of Christ. It's most clearly seen, I think, in his being used of God and placed in a position so that God's people would be saved, preserved, treated well, much as God used others before him, like Joseph. You think about how God took Joseph to an exiled land, almost, if you will, and how he was imprisoned unjustly until he rose to the top. He was put in a position where God uses him in his faithfulness to save and preserve the people of God. Makes me think of Esther as well. She did that. Now, she was risen up by God to serve in that position where she could, really the result would be that the people of God were getting a favorable treatment by those who were over them, the foreign king. Well, Daniel grows in his wisdom and his favor with each of the kings that he serves under. Nebuchadnezzar was first. I think there's a list up here. Nathaniel, you start off with Nebuchadnezzar as the third one. Yeah. King Nebuchadnezzar was the first king, and then Belshazzar, and now Darius. And each of those kings treated the Jewish people very well because of what Daniel had done and his position. Eventually, he's going to use favor with Daniel under King Cyrus, the last of the kings that we're talking about, to allow the return of the exiles. And not only that, but the rebuilding of the temple and so on. Now, what's even more evident in this being a type of Christ is how the blessing to the people of God comes through Daniel's suffering. See the parallel there. Daniel, like Christ, was found to be without complaint. And that is, his people couldn't find a reason to accuse him. And so what do they have to do? They have to manufacture a reason to attack. Instead, they fabricate a charge in order to send him to his death. Now, Daniel is thrown into a certain death, the den of lions, a place where it was certain he would be killed. And yet, remarkably, he comes out alive. The result is that the enemies of God are judged, and they're sent to their own deaths. And all of that's to say that in Daniel we're given a taste of what's coming. A more full and complete salvation through someone who actually went to the point clear of death, and then it still comes out alive. That's Christ. Daniel lived faithfully. Now, he did not live sinlessly, like Christ, but as a believer, he's an imitation of the Christ to come. Similarly, we're called to live faithfully in the footsteps of Christ, imitating the Messiah who has come, and we must imitate Daniel as a one who foreshadowed Christ as well, and that calls for being above reproach. Now, here's the thing. Do we realistically think it's possible to be above reproach in our culture, in our day? How do you and I aspire to be living above reproach like this? I hope you know that we're called to it. It's not merely elders of the church who are called to be above reproach. It's every member of the church. All believers are called, are they not, to be holy as their God is holy. And that's a pretty high standard of holiness. So, is that even realistic? To believe that we can stand out in our world and say, I have been faithful, and give people no reason for complaint? Is it realistic to be okay in our day? It should be noted very clearly that all of this took place in Daniel's life because of one thing. And if it's going to be true of your life, it'll be the same thing. It's not that he's just an outstanding guy, that Daniel was just an amazing character and he was really great. But actually, as Darius recognizes the cause, it's in chapter 6, verse 3. It says, there was an excellent spirit in him. And actually, you'll find that in chapter 5, when the king, a different king, says this, there's an excellent spirit in him. The king made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers because of an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding in him. Chapter 5, verse 14, Belshazzar says, I have heard of you that the Spirit of gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. What is it that makes Daniel like this? It's the excellent spirit that's in him. He's distinguished above all the others because an excellent spirit is in him. And that excellent spirit was given to him by God. Indeed, the spirit he has is the Holy Spirit. Not of the gods, but of God himself, the Holy Spirit. If you and I are to be above reproach, if we're to be filled with knowledge and wisdom as Daniel was, it's only because God's Spirit has been created to dwell in us and to show himself in power. Now, I don't know how you picture in your mind these stories when you see a man thrown into the lion's den, how old he was. But it's pretty likely that Daniel was 80 years old by this point. 80 years old. Those seeking to find fault in a man had been watching a man for many years by this time. And they still couldn't find anything to hold up against him. He had been faithful throughout his lifetime, and that's infuriating to the enemies of God. Those who are filled with the Spirit are often targets of the enemy. And the enemy would remove that person entirely if they could, like in the case of Stephen, who had a similar kind of spirit within him. And yet they were able to put him to death. They wished to kill the man, not just remove him from the scene. And that's the purpose of all this mudslinging campaign. It's not simply to just ruin his reputation, but to remove him entirely. And so you have the satraps and the prefects and the governors of the story under the influence of the enemy. No doubt, right? This is Satan's battle between the kingdoms. And he wishes to put an end to that witness that Daniel's given. The fact that they're conspiring against Daniel is seen in a couple different places in the text. Did you see it? Psalm 2 just screams out to me as I hear this. They came by agreement to the king. Psalm 2 says, the kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. That's what they're doing here. They're taking counsel. They come by agreement, and it says that 3 times in the text, that they're coming together and they're plotting. That's what Psalm 2 says will happen. Here they counsel together. They plot against the Lord's servant. Clearly the wise men who had been working alongside Daniel for some time didn't learn the lesson of Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't learn the lesson of Belshazzar. And thus they thought they could defy the true God. But you'll remember Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar learned the hard way. That Daniel summarized was the lesson in Daniel 5:21, namely that the Most High God rules the kingdoms of mankind and sets over it whomever he will. As Nebuchadnezzar himself had sent out this decree after he learned the lesson, he says, all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and Yahweh does not, he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand. And yet failing to learn that lesson of God's providence in history results, as it always does, and it still is doing, in repeating the foolishness. Why do the heathen nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? He who sits in the heaven laughs, and the Lord holds them in derision. It's truly folly to plot against an almighty God, plot against a sovereign king over all things. Aren't you glad that you're on the side of this king? You're on the side of this God who's shown mercy to you and made you one of his children. We ought not to be surprised when people are plotting. They're in agreement about these oppositions to the Christian faith. They're displaying what happens when the world sees Christians displaying a taste of heaven as they show a taste of hell. They're showing their roots, their loyalties. And of course the law these men get Darius to pass is folly, according to Psalm 2. What's the command? No one may pray to anyone but you for 30 days. So basically, if you're to be prayed to, you must be divine. What happens on the 31st day? Are you no longer divine? The people shouldn't pray to you anymore? They can ignore you then? For 30 days you're God and then you're not, and during those 30 days disobedience deserves the death penalty, but after that don't worry about it. You see, it's silly. The things that they come up with are silly. The law's screwy from the start. But Darius, who seems to be a fairly good king in the sense that he's got a real he has a heart for Daniel. He appreciates that Daniel has served him very well. He realizes ultimately that he's made a mistake, but too late. He falls into the schemes of the wise men. Why? Because they appeal to something that is appealed to us all the time when we stumble, and that's pride. It's our own pride. You see that pride again and again in the text of Daniel, and it's one of the themes that goes throughout this, and I hope we're catching it again and again. What makes Nebuchadnezzar want to put up a big statue to himself where people bow down to that? It's the same thing. It's pride. And it keeps showing up. How easily we're enticed to seek praise for ourselves, to elevate ourselves to the place of God, and to yield to the enticements to inflate our own pride. And that's exactly what this plan of the wise men does. It encouraged the king to have people pray to him. That enticement of Satan is the sin of every secular society, in putting self in the place of God again and again. And so Darius enacts a foolish scheme. And the decree is sent out that anybody who prays to anybody other than Darius will be thrown into the lion's den. Now what do you do when you're a believer in that context? The pressure's on now, and it's not just basic pressure. I might lose my job, I might have some difficulties with my schedule, they're going to put me on a bad shift. No, it's you're going to die if you follow God if you follow your God in this way. Daniel is a minority of one. He stands in the midst of an utterly pagan culture. The temptation to fudge on this law must have been tremendous, wouldn't it? Don't you think about the different alternatives and ways we could have got around this? Maybe I'll just shut my curtains when I pray. I'll still be following God. I'll be following the commitment to my God. It's just that they won't know. The world won't know. Who would ever know if I just shut my curtains and I pray in private? I keep my faith to the living God to myself. But he doesn't do that. He knew that his faith is not meant to be private. You hear that? The Christian faith is not meant to be private. Your faith is not meant to be private. He knew that God had saved him and put him in a position to be an open testimony of faith to the lost. He knew that God could save him if he chose to do so, just as the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had said. Our God is able to save us from the fiery furnace. But like in their case, and like in Daniel's case, he had no absolute assurance that God would do that. Right? He didn't know that God would save him from the lions. But you'll notice in verse 11, when the men find Daniel at prayer, what's he doing? He's praying for God's help. When the decree comes, and he knows he's being faced by the opposition of the culture, by the government, if you want to put it that way, he goes to prayer faithfully again, as he always does, but he's now praying, Lord, preserve me through this, as I testify openly about your goodness. More important than knowing God would save him in the particular instance is he knew that obeying and serving the one true God had the supreme goal in his life. It was the supreme goal. And what Daniel knew to be true, he's going to practice, and he's going to practice it openly. Now, I made the point earlier that we would likely not change our habits unless we saw how similar Daniel's situation is to our own. And we believe that the principles that apply to Daniel also apply to us. And I've got a quote up here now from James Boyce, who once commented on the Christian church in the 21st century. And this is what James Boyce said. If we practice our religion on the reservation and do not attempt to bring it out into the real world, the world will tolerate us. But if we determine to take a stand on any important issue on the basis of genuine religious principles, the fury of our secular society will break all bounds. Well, that's to say that our situation today is very, very similar to Daniel's. Had he shut his curtains, he would have faded into obscurity. They wouldn't have noticed. They wouldn't have cared. But he knew that serving the true God meant not hiding his faith, but living it open and living it openly in a public arena. This is a hard question. Do we shut our curtains? Are you shutting your curtains? Or are you living your faith openly before a watching and sometimes a very critical world? That's a big challenge. It's our big challenge. And it's what our world in 2023 needs. It's what the city of Frankston needs very much. People who have the conviction to stand up and be noticed for their faith in the living God. As with Daniel, first we've got to resolve not to be defiled by the world. But then we need to resolve to not make our commitments and our convictions something that we just hold in here. But we have to be willing to voice it, to be open about it. Frankston needs Christians who are more concerned with living faithfulness to their living God than being accepted by those who are around them and their peers. The world needs people in this century like believers in so many previous centuries who were willing to stand against the opposition and remain faithful to their convictions even to the point of death. Not belligerent. Now catch this. As we're living openly before the world, I don't want Christians to be confident belligerent and annoying and defiant Christians. That's not what we're to do as we're open in our faith. That does not represent Christ well at all. Rather, we want to be confident, consistent, and Christ-like Christians openly. Daniel's character appealed to Darius. Darius valued this man because of his character. So we want to be Christians as we live openly, not in a belligerent way, always complaining about this, that, and everything else about our world and showing, Christians. I'm sure glad that Christians aren't like that. You see? No. Confident but consistent, Christ-like Christians. There's likely no possibility that when you exercise your faith in Australia today that you're going to face the death penalty for doing so. Now, I sure hope that remains the case. But I'll tell you this, we need people who are committed to their Lord in such a way that should it be asked of you, you do it. Amen? You believe that? But unfortunately, we're not even willing to be inconvenienced, let alone martyred. We don't want to miss our regular euchre club gatherings or our bowling league or the TV program or footy game in order to serve other people or to go to the prayer meeting or to go visit somebody in the hospital or in the jail. Where are those who were like the missionaries of the 18th century who gave up everything and they got on a rickety old boat and they sailed for months to go live in a mud hut in a land where it was likely that they're going to die of malaria just so they could take the gospel to someone? Where are those who love Jesus and that love outshines every other calling in their life? We need Christians who love God and who are faithful. We need people who have that excellent spirit. We need Christians who seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness and who trust God to meet the other needs in their life. So I return to our stated main point of this message, and I'll close with this. The calling of every believer is to be above reproach in a hostile world. And it's very likely that you're going to face opposition. But know that God is honored. His kingdom is advanced when believers are faithful. And you may live in peace because God is your protector. Now we know God doesn't always spare us on this earth, but He is able to turn the heat off in a burning furnace. He is able to shut the mouths of roaring lions. He will be our deliverer, whether from the temporal threats of this life, or ultimately, of course, from death itself. Verse 22 says, Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. That sounds remarkably like there wasn't any smell of smoke on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's place. It's what our world needs because we trust in our God. Not merely those who say, Lord, Lord, but those who are serving Him with their whole heart, their strength, their mind. They're living not complaining and griping about the world around them. They're doing it with honesty and conviction and love and faithfulness to Christ. So friends, may He strengthen you to bear witness to your world that, and I'm quoting the scripture, He is the living God enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and His dominion shall be to the ends of the earth. He delivers. He rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth.